What you're about to hear isn't just a story. It's a warning whispered across generations, a tragedy so profound that even the courthouse where it unfolded refused to keep records of what transpired within its walls. In the winter of 1847, in a small Pennsylvania town whose name has been deliberately obscured from most historical accounts, something happened that would challenge everything we believe about human nature, justice, and the thin veil between civilization and chaos. This is the case that made seasoned judges weep openly in court, that caused 3 separate juries to refuse deliberation, and that ultimately led to the burning of an entire family estate by the very townspeople who once called it home. Before we begin, I need you to understand something. The documents I've uncovered were sealed for over a century and 20 years. The few historians who knew of this case's existence called it the incident we must forget. But some stories refuse to stay buried, no matter how deep we dig the grave. What makes this case truly disturbing isn't the violence, though there was plenty. It isn't the betrayal, though that cuts to the bone. It's what it reveals about the darkness that can flourish in plain sight, in a God-fearing community, behind the closed doors of America's most respected families. If you're watching this alone, perhaps you shouldn't be. What happened to the Matthias family will stay with you long after this video ends, because at its heart, this isn't just their story. It's a mirror held up to the worst possibilities that lurk in every family, every relationship, every human heart. And the most disturbing part, it could happen again. It could be happening right now. Are you ready? Because once you know what I know, you can't unknow it. This is the case that America tried to erase from history. This is the truth about the Matthias family. And God help us all, this is what we're capable of when we look away. The house on Sorrow Hill, the town of Ashford Hollow, no longer exists on any map you'll find today, but in 1847, it was a thriving community of just over 800 souls nestled in the Allegheny Mountains of western Pennsylvania. The people there were primarily of German and Scottish descent, hard-working folk who built their lives around the Presbyterian church, the sawmill, and the unspoken rules that governed proper society. They were people who believed in the Bible, in hard work, and in keeping their curtains drawn against their neighbors' prying eyes. At the highest point in Ashford Hollow stood a house that the locals had taken to calling the Matthias estate, though the family had only lived there for 6 years. It was an imposing structure of dark stone and weathered wood, 3 stories tall with windows that seemed to watch the town below like judgmental eyes. The house sat on what everyone called Sorrow Hill, a name that predated the Matthias family by decades, given to the place after a particularly harsh winter in 1803 had killed an entire family of settlers who'd tried to homestead there. Some said the ground was cursed. Others said it was just poor luck and poorer judgment to build so far from the protection of the community. But Gustav Matthias wasn't a man who believed in curses or who cared much for community protection. Gustav Matthias had arrived in Ashford Hollow in the autumn of 1841 with his wife Helena, their 3 children, and enough money to buy the old Sorrow Hill property outright, no questions asked. He was a tall man, rail-thin with sharp features and eyes the color of winter ice. He claimed to have made his fortune in shipping out of Philadelphia, though he was vague on the details. Helena was his opposite in almost every way, soft and round, where he was angular and hard, with a gentle voice that barely rose above a whisper, and a nervous habit of wringing her hands whenever her husband entered a room. Their children were Anna, 16 when they arrived, with her mother's soft features but her father's unsettling eyes, Wilhelm, 14, a boy who seemed to shrink into himself whenever anyone looked directly at him, and little Margaret, just 8 years old, who still believed in fairy tales and goodness and all the things the world would soon teach her to forget. The family kept to themselves those first few years, which wasn't unusual for newcomers in a tight-knit community like Ashford Hollow. Gustav hired local men to help expand the house, adding a strange tower room on the eastern side and reinforcing the cellar with thick stone walls that seemed excessive for simple food storage. He paid well but demanded absolute discretion, making each worker sign a document promising never to speak about the interior layout of the house. Most men found this odd, but not alarming. Rich folks had their peculiarities after all, and money was money. Helena was occasionally seen in town, always accompanied by her husband, purchasing fabric and basic supplies. She would smile weakly at the other women but never lingered for conversation. 2. Children were enrolled in the small schoolhouse that served Ashford Hollow's youth, and it was there that the first real cracks in the family's facade began to show. Matthias was an exceptional student, brilliant even, with a particular gift for literature and languages. The schoolmaster, Mr. Cornelius Webb, a kind man in his 50s who genuinely loved teaching, took special interest in her education. He would later testify that Anna seemed to carry a profound sadness behind her eyes, a weariness that no 16-year-old should possess. She excelled in her studies but never participated in the social activities that the other young people enjoyed. She never attended church socials or harvest dances. She never formed close friendships with the other girls. When Mr. Webb gently inquired about this, Anna simply said that her father preferred the family to remain close-knit, that too much socializing led to loose morals and corrupted thinking. It was a rehearsed answer, delivered in a flat tone that suggested she'd given it many times before. Wilhelm was the opposite of his sister in academic achievement, but similar in social isolation. He was a poor student, struggling with even basic arithmetic and reading, though Mr. Webb suspected this had less to do with ability and more to do with profound anxiety. The boy's hands shook when called upon to read aloud. He would sometimes freeze entirely, unable to speak, his face going pale and his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. The other children, with the casual cruelty of youth, began to mock him, calling him Wilhelm the weak and scared mouse Matthias. The teasing might have escalated into worse bullying if not or Anna's fierce protection of her younger brother. On more than one occasion, she was seen pulling boys twice her size away from Wilhelm, her gentle demeanor transforming to something almost feral when her family was threatened. Little Margaret seemed the most normal of the three children, at least at first. She was a dreamy child who loved to draw and would often sit by herself during recess, sketching flowers and birds and fantastical creatures in the margins of her slate. But even Margaret had her oddities. She never drew people, never. When asked why, she said that people were too complicated, too many secrets hiding behind their faces. It was a strange thing for an 8-year-old to say, strange enough that Mr. Webb made a note of it in his personal journal, a journal that would later become crucial evidence in understanding what was happening in the house on Sorrow Hill. The first real alarm bell came in the spring of 1843, about 18 months after the Matthias family had settled in Ashford Hollow. Anna arrived at school with a pronounced limp and a bruise darkening her left cheekbone. When Mr. Webb expressed concern, Anna explained that she had fallen down the cellar stairs while helping her mother with preserves. It was a plausible explanation, and Mr. Webb had no reason to doubt it, though something in Anna's eyes, a kind of pleading desperation, made him uneasy. He made a note to visit the Matthias home, to check on the family's well-being under the guise of discussing Anna's exceptional progress in her studies. That visit never happened. 2 days later, Gustav Matthias appeared at the schoolhouse personally, something he had never done before. He informed Mr. Webb that Anna would be continuing her education at home from now on. The girl was nearly 17, he explained, and it was time she focused on domestic skills and preparation for marriage, rather than filling her head with literature and philosophy. Mr. Webb protested, arguing that Anna had the potential to become a teacher herself, perhaps even to attend one of the new women's colleges being established back east. Gustav's response was cold and final. His daughter's future was his concern and his alone, and he would thank Mr. Webb to remember his place. The schoolmaster had no legal recourse. In 1843, a father's authority over his children was nearly absolute. Anna left the schoolhouse that day with her head down, her books cradled against her chest like a shield, and she never returned. Without Anna's protection, Wilhelm's situation at school deteriorated rapidly. The bullying intensified, and the boy seemed to fold in on himself even more. He began having what Mr. Webb could only describe as episodes. He would suddenly stop whatever he was doing, his eyes would go distant and unfocused, and he would begin to whisper rapidly in German, a language Mr. Webb didn't speak but recognized from the many German families in the area. These episodes would last anywhere from a few seconds to several minutes, and when they ended, Wilhelm would have no memory of them. He would look around in confusion, sometimes finding himself in a different part of the schoolroom than where he'd started, with no idea how he'd gotten there. Mr. Webb consulted with Dr. Ephraim Cross, the town's only physician, about Wilhelm's condition. Dr. Cross, a pragmatic man who'd seen more than his share of human suffering in his 40 years of practice, suggested the boy might be suffering from a nervous disorder, perhaps brought on by stress or trauma. He recommended that Wilhelm be examined properly, but when Mr. Webb suggested this to Gustav Matthias during a chance encounter in town, the man's reaction was swift and hostile. There was nothing wrong with his son, Gustav insisted, that wouldn't be cured by discipline and hard work. The boy was soft, coddled by his mother, and what he needed was toughening up, not coddling by town busybodies who didn't understand the first thing about raising children properly. 3 months later, in August of 1843, Wilhelm stopped coming to school altogether. Gustav sent word that the boy would be working full-time on the family property, learning practical skills. He was 14 now, old enough to earn his keep. This left only little Margaret attending the schoolhouse, and even she seemed to be fading before everyone's eyes. The bright, dreamy child who loved to draw had become quiet and withdrawn. Her drawings, when she made them at all, had changed. The flowers had wilted on the page, the birds looked like they were falling from the sky, and though she still didn't draw people, she had started drawing shadows, long dark shapes that seemed to reach across her slate with grasping fingers. When Mr. Webb asked Margaret about her drawings, she would only say that she was drawing what she saw at home. When he pressed her to explain, she went silent, her small face closing up like a door slamming shut. The town of Ashford Hollow might have intervened sooner if not for the simple fact that the Matthias family seemed, from the outside, to be functioning normally enough. Gustav was seen regularly in town, conducting business, purchasing supplies, always properly dressed and appropriately formal. Helena accompanied him sometimes, still wringing her hands, still speaking in whispers, but alive and apparently healthy. The house on Sorrow Hill showed no obvious signs of distress, no screams echoed down to the town below, no dramatic scenes played out in public. It was all very proper, very private, very much in keeping with the values of a community that believed a man's home was his castle and what happened behind closed doors was nobody else's concern. But there were whispers. There are always whispers in small towns, and Ashford Hollow was no exception. The workers who had helped expand the Matthias house, despite their signed agreements to remain silent, occasionally let details slip after a few drinks at the Hollow's only tavern. They spoke of strange additions to the cellar, of rooms built within rooms, of doors that locked from the outside only. They mentioned the tower room, which had no furniture that they could see, just bare walls and a single window too high for anyone inside to reach. They talked about the thickness of the walls, how sound wouldn't carry, how you could scream yourself hoarse in that house and nobody outside would hear a thing. These whispers might have remained just whispers if not for Sarah Brennan, a young widow who worked as a seamstress and occasionally did mending for the wealthier families in the area. In October of 1843, Helena Matthias came to Sarah's small cottage with an unusual request. She needed several dresses altered, taken in significantly, as she had apparently lost a considerable amount of weight. She also needed tiers in the fabric repaired, though the tiers were in odd places, at the shoulders and wrists, as if the dresses had been grabbed and pulled violently. Sarah, who prided herself on minding her own business, nevertheless noticed that Helena's hands were shaking badly as she laid out the dresses. She noticed, too, that Helena had bruises ringing her wrists like dark bracelets, and what looked like older yellowing bruises along her collarbone visible above the high collar of her dress. Sarah made the repairs and said nothing, as was proper. But 3 weeks later, Helena returned with more work. This time, she needed children's clothing mended, Anna's and Margaret's specifically. The repairs needed were extensive: tears, missing buttons, hem damage that looked like it had been caused by someone being dragged. And this time, when Helena laid out the clothes, her hands were shaking so badly that she dropped several items. As Sarah bent to help pick them up, she saw that Helena was crying silently, tears streaming down her face without a sound. The two women stood there in Sarah's small cottage, surrounded by damaged clothing, and Sarah made a decision that would later haunt her for the rest of her life. She asked Helena if everything was all right at home. It was a simple question, asked quietly, with genuine concern. Helena's reaction was immediate and terrifying. She grabbed Sarah's arm with surprising strength, her fingers digging in painfully, and she leaned in close. Her breath smelled sour, and her eyes were wild with an emotion Sarah couldn't quite name. Fear, certainly, but something else too. Desperation. Maybe on madness. Helena whispered a single sentence, rapid and urgent. "If something happens to me, remember that I loved my children." Then she released Sarah's arm, gathered up the clothing, and fled the cottage without another word, leaving Sarah standing there in shock, her arm aching where Helena had gripped it. Sarah Brennan struggled with what to do with this information. She was a practical woman, a widow who understood the complexities of marriage and the limited options available to women in difficult situations. She also understood the social dynamics of Ashford Hollow, how an accusation against a wealthy man like Gustav Matthias could backfire disastrously on both herself and Helena if she was wrong, or even if she was right but couldn't prove it. She decided to confide in Pastor Wilhelm Schneider, the minister of the Presbyterian church that most of Ashford Hollow attended, though notably the Matthias family did not. Pastor Schneider was in his 60s, a stern but fundamentally decent man who took his spiritual responsibilities seriously. When Sarah told him about her encounter with Helena, about the bruises and the tears and that strange urgent whisper, the pastor listened gravely and promised to visit the Matthias home to check on the family's spiritual well-being. It was a reasonable compromise, a way to investigate without making direct accusations. Pastor Schneider made his visit to the house on Sorrow Hill on a gray November afternoon in 1843. He would later describe the experience in testimony that would chill everyone who heard it. Gustav answered the door himself and was initially resistant to allowing the pastor inside, claiming it was not a convenient time. But Pastor Schneider was not easily dissuaded, and eventually Gustav relented, allowing him into the front parlor, a formally decorated room that seemed designed more for show than for actual living. The room was cold despite the season, and Pastor Schneider noticed that while there were lamps and candles available, none were lit, leaving the space in a perpetual twilight gloom. Helena was summoned to greet their guest, appearing after several minutes with her eyes downcast and her hands, as always, nervously wringing. She looked thinner than when Sarah had last seen her, almost skeletal, and there was a hollowness to her cheeks that suggested she hadn't been eating properly. The pastor asked after the children, and Gustav explained that they were occupied with their studies and chores and couldn't be disturbed. When Pastor Schneider suggested that he might visit again when the whole family could be present for a blessing of the home, Gustav's expression turned cold. They had no need for blessings or for the church's interference in their private family matters, he stated. They were managing quite well on their own, and the pastor's concern, while noted, was unnecessary. It was a clear dismissal, and Pastor Schneider had no choice but to accept it. But as he was being shown out, he heard something that would stay with him for the rest of his days. From somewhere deep in the house, from below or perhaps from behind the many closed doors on the upper floors, he heard a sound. It was brief, cut off almost as soon as it began, but unmistakable. It was a scream, a child's scream, high-pitched and terrified and abruptly silenced. Pastor Schneider stopped in his tracks and turned to Gustav. "What was that?" he asked. Gustav's face remained impassive. "The wind," he said. "These old houses make strange noises, but it wasn't the wind, and both men knew it." The pastor made one more attempt. "Mr. Matthias, if there is anything troubling your family, any burden you're carrying, the church is here to help. There is no shame in admitting when we need—" "Get out," Gustav interrupted, his voice low and dangerous. "Get out of my house and do not return. My family is my concern. What happens under my roof is my business and mine alone. This is America, Pastor, not some village in the old country where the church runs every aspect of people's lives. We have freedom here, privacy, and I'll thank you to respect both." Pastor Schneider left the house on Sorrow Hill with a sick feeling in his stomach and a terrible certainty that something very wrong was happening behind those thick stone walls. But like Sarah Brennan before him, he was trapped by the social and legal constraints of the time. A man's authority over his household was sacrosanct. Without clear evidence of a crime, without a complaint from the victims themselves, which was unlikely if they were being controlled or threatened, there was little anyone could do. The pastor did the only thing he could think of. He began asking discreet questions around town, trying to piece together a fuller picture of the Matthias family and their life on Sorrow Hill. What he discovered was disturbing in its consistency. Every tradesperson who had dealt with Gustav described him as cold and controlling. Every worker who had been inside the house mentioned its strange layout, the excessive security, the sense that it was designed less as a home and more as a prison. And several people, independently of each other, mentioned that they had seen lights burning in the tower room at odd hours, late into the night, and had heard sounds they couldn't quite identify, rhythmic and disturbing, carrying across the dark fields when the wind was right. As autumn turned to winter and winter to spring, little Margaret stopped attending school as well. Gustav sent word that the girl was ill, nothing serious, just a persistent cough that required rest and isolation. Dr. Cross offered to visit and examine her, but Gustav declined, saying they were managing her care themselves and she would return to school when she was fully recovered. She never did. By the summer of 1844, the Matthias family had effectively disappeared from public life. Gustav still came to town for supplies, always alone now, his face growing harder and more closed off with each passing month. Helena was no longer seen at all. The children were ghosts, existing only in memory and rumor. The town of Ashford Hollow told itself comfortable lies. The family valued their privacy. They were managing their affairs in their own way. It wasn't anyone else's business. People convinced themselves that the strange sounds occasionally heard from Sorrow Hill were just the wind, just the house settling, just their imagination. They chose not to see what was happening in plain sight because seeing would require action, and action would disrupt the careful social order they had built. This willful blindness would continue for 3 more years, 3 years during which unimaginable things were happening in the house on Sorrow Hill, 3 years during which a family was slowly being destroyed from within, 3 years that would culminate in a night of horror so profound that it would scar everyone who learned of it. But we're not there yet, because before we can understand the horror of what was discovered, we need to understand who the Matthias family really was, what darkness drove Gustav Matthias, and what was really happening behind those thick stone walls while the town below went about its business, choosing comfort over courage, silence over truth. The truth, when it finally came out, would shake Ashford Hollow to its foundations and force everyone to confront the terrible consequences of looking away. The night the silence broke. The winter of 1846 to 1847 was particularly harsh in western Pennsylvania. Snow fell early and heavy, and by January the roads in and out of Ashford Hollow were nearly impassable. The town hunkered down, as it always did during the worst of winter, families drawing close around their fires, living off their preserved stores, waiting for spring. The house on Sorrow Hill sat dark and silent through the storms, smoke occasionally rising from its chimneys, but otherwise giving no sign of the life within. It had been over 2 years since any of the Matthias children had been seen in public. Helena hadn't been spotted in town since the summer of 1844. Only Gustav emerged from the house, trudging down the hill every few weeks for supplies, his face weathered and grim, his conversation limited to what was absolutely necessary for conducting business. The townspeople had grown accustomed to the family's absence, had integrated it into the normal fabric of their community. The Matthias family was simply that strange, wealthy household on the hill, private and peculiar, but ultimately not their concern. This comfortable ignorance was shattered on the night of February 15, 1847. The first person to realize something was wrong was Thomas Brennan, Sarah's teenage son, who worked at the mill and often walked the perimeter road on his way home from late shifts. On this particular night, bitterly cold with a wind that cut through clothing like a knife, Thomas was making his way along the path that curved below Sorrow Hill, when he saw something that stopped him in his tracks. Fire. Not a house fire, but something smaller, more deliberate. A figure was moving in the snow outside the Matthias house, and they were burning something. Thomas crept closer, his curiosity overcoming his caution, until he could make out more details in the moonlight reflecting off the snow. The figure was a woman, thin as a scarecrow, wearing only a nightdress that whipped around her in the wind. Her feet were bare in the snow. Her hair hung loose and wild around her shoulders, and she was feeding papers into a small fire she'd built, watching them burn with an intensity that was frightening in its focus. Thomas recognized her, though barely. It was Helena Matthias, but transformed almost beyond recognition. She had always been heavy-set, but now she was skeletal, her nightdress hanging off her frame like it was draped over bones. Her face was gaunt, her eyes sunken into deep hollows, and even from a distance Thomas could see that she was shaking, whether from cold or emotion he couldn't tell. He was trying to decide whether to approach her or run for help when Helena looked up and saw him. Their eyes met across the snowy field, and what Thomas saw in her face would haunt his dreams for years to come. It was a look of such profound relief mixed with such absolute terror that it seemed to encompass every human emotion at once. Her mouth opened, and she tried to speak, but at first no sound came out. Then, with what seemed like enormous effort, she found her voice. "Help them," she croaked, her words barely audible over the wind. "Please God in heaven, help my children." Then she collapsed into the snow, and the papers she'd been burning scattered in the wind, their edges still glowing with embers. Thomas ran. He ran faster than he'd ever run in his life, straight down the hill into town, shouting for help, pounding on doors, raising an alarm. Within 20 minutes, a group of men had assembled, including Pastor Schneider, Dr. Cross, and Sheriff Henry Morrison, a practical man in his 40s who'd kept the peace in Ashford Hollow for nearly a decade without ever encountering anything more serious than public drunkenness or property disputes. They armed themselves with lanterns and medical supplies and made their way up Sorrow Hill in a group, uncertain what they would find, but certain it would be bad. Helena was still lying in the snow where she'd fallen. Dr. Cross rushed to her while the other men gathered the scattered papers she'd been burning. What they read in those partially burned pages made their blood run cold. They were diary entries, written in Helena's careful hand, dating back years. The pages that remained legible enough to read told a story of systematic abuse, of a household ruled by terror, of children subjected to punishments that went far beyond discipline into the realm of torture. Helena had documented it all in heartbreaking detail. The days locked in the cellar rooms, the meals withheld as punishment for imagined infractions, the elaborate psychological games designed to break their spirits, the physical abuse that had escalated year by year. She had written it all down, perhaps as a way to maintain her own sanity, perhaps as evidence she hoped would someday see light, perhaps simply because she needed to tell someone, even if that someone was only the blank page. One entry, dated September 1845, described Anna being locked in the tower room for 6 days with only water because she had been caught trying to write a letter, though to whom the letter was addressed and what it contained, Helena didn't say. Another entry from December 1845 described Wilhelm being forced to stand in the cellar in ice-cold water for hours because he had suffered one of his episodes during a meal, which Gustav considered a deliberate show of disrespect. A third entry, this one from just a month ago in January 1847, was the most chilling of all. Little Margaret, now 12 years old, had stopped speaking entirely. She hadn't said a word in over a year, had retreated so far into herself that Helena feared she might never come back. Dr. Cross examined Helena quickly there in the snow and determined she was suffering from severe malnutrition, exposure, and what he could only describe as complete nervous exhaustion. She was conscious but barely coherent, mumbling about needing to burn the evidence, about how Gustav couldn't know, about how she had to protect them even though it was too late. It had always been too late. The doctor and 2 men carried Helena down to the town, to the doctor's own home where his wife could care for her, while Sheriff Morrison and the remaining men, now numbering about a dozen as more had joined when they heard what was happening, approached the house on Sorrow Hill. The front door was locked. Sheriff Morrison pounded on it, identifying himself and demanding entry. There was no response. He pounded again, harder, his voice taking on the official tone of legal authority. "Gustav Matthias, this is Sheriff Morrison. Open this door immediately. We have your wife here. She's in need of medical attention, and she's made serious allegations. We need to check on the welfare of your children. Open this door now or I'll have it broken down." Still nothing. No sound from within, no movement. The house might have been completely empty for all the response they got. Sheriff Morrison made the decision. "Break it down," he ordered, and several men moved forward with a heavy beam they'd brought from the mill for just this purpose. It took 4 solid hits before the reinforced door gave way with a crack of splitting wood. The men entered the house with their lanterns held high, and immediately they knew something was terribly wrong. The smell hit them first, a complex mixture of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, human waste, and something else, something sickly sweet that Dr. Cross, who had joined them after ensuring Helena was being cared for, recognized immediately as infection. The house was cold despite the fireplace in the main room being full of still warm ashes. It was dark, all the lamps and candles extinguished, and it was silent in a way that felt oppressive. The silence itself was a living thing pressing down on them. They moved through the first floor quickly, finding it largely empty of people but full of disturbing details. The formal parlor where Pastor Schneider had been received years ago was coated in dust, clearly unused for months or perhaps years. The kitchen was in a state of bizarre contradiction, with some areas meticulously clean and organized while others were filthy, covered in grime and rotting food. There were locks on the pantry door, the kind that secured from the outside. There were heavy bolts on several interior doors, also designed to lock from the outside rather than in. The dining room table was set for one person only. As they moved deeper into the house, following the increasingly unpleasant smell, they found the door to the cellar. It too was locked from the outside, with not one but 3 separate bolt systems. Sheriff Morrison's hands shook as he worked the bolts open, a sense of dread building in his chest. The men behind him had gone quiet, their earlier bravado fading as they confronted whatever nightmare awaited below. The cellar stairs descended into darkness so complete that their lanterns seemed to barely penetrate it. The smell was worse here, much worse, and several of the men had to stop and fight down nausea before they could continue. At the bottom of the stairs they found themselves in a stone-walled passage with several doors leading off it, exactly as the workers had whispered about years ago. Sheriff Morrison tried the first door, locked. The second door, also locked. The third door opened, and what they found inside would be burned into their memories for the rest of their lives. It was Wilhelm, or what was left of Wilhelm. The boy was 19 years old now, though he looked 60, his hair prematurely gray, his body wasted to skin and bones. He was chained to the wall by one ankle with a heavy iron shackle, the kind used to restrain animals or prisoners. The chain was just long enough to allow him to reach a bucket in the corner, which served as his toilet and was overflowing. He had a thin, filthy blanket and a wooden bowl that looked like it might have once contained food but was now empty. When the lantern light hit him, Wilhelm cringed back against the wall, his arms coming up to protect his face, whimpering like a beaten dog. His eyes were wild and unfocused, and he didn't seem to recognize the men as human beings, only as threats. Dr. Cross approached slowly, speaking in a gentle voice, trying to calm the terrified young man, but Wilhelm only whimpered louder and tried to make himself smaller, pressing himself into the corner as if he could disappear into the stone itself. It took 2 men to hold Wilhelm still while Dr. Cross examined him, and a blacksmith they'd brought to break the shackle that bound him to the wall. Even as they worked to free him, Wilhelm didn't fight, didn't try to escape. He simply shook and whimpered and stared at nothing, completely broken. Once free, he curled into a ball on the floor and wouldn't move. They wrapped him in clean blankets and carried him upstairs, out of that hellish cellar and into fresh air. One of the townsmen stayed with him while the others returned below, because there were still 2 more children unaccounted for. The second locked door opened to reveal Anna's prison. She was in slightly better condition than her brother, at least physically. She too was chained, but her chain allowed her more movement around a slightly larger space. She had a cot with a thin mattress, a small table, and evidence that she had been given more food than Wilhelm, though still far from adequate. But the state of the room suggested something even more sinister. The walls were covered in writing, scratched into the stone with what must have been a nail or piece of metal Anna had somehow acquired. The writing covered every available surface, years of desperate thoughts and prayers and pieces of the literature she'd loved so much, now reproduced from memory onto stone. Shakespeare and Austen and biblical passages, all mixed together with Anna's own words, her own pleas for help, her own descent into despair documented in frantic scratches on cold stone. Anna herself was sitting on the cot, perfectly still, perfectly composed, when the men entered. Unlike Wilhelm, she didn't cower. She simply looked at them with those unsettling ice-blue eyes, so like her father's, and smiled. It wasn't a happy smile. It was the smile of someone whose mind had finally broken under pressure too great to bear. "Have you come to let me out for dinner?" she asked politely, as if addressing guests at a formal party. "Father will be displeased if I'm late. He does so hate it when we're late." She stood up, smoothed down her filthy dress, and held out her hands for the shackle to be removed, still smiling that terrible smile. Dr. Cross examined her quickly and determined that while she was malnourished and clearly suffering from psychological trauma, she was physically stable enough to be moved. Unlike Wilhelm, Anna walked out of her prison on her own, though she kept up a constant stream of polite, disconnected conversation about dinner parties and social obligations and what dress she should wear, all delivered in a calm, cheerful voice that was infinitely more disturbing than screaming would have been. That left one more locked door, and behind it, they knew, was 12-year-old Margaret. The men approached this final door with a sense of dread so profound that several of them had to stop and steady themselves before continuing. What could have been done to a child in this house of horrors? What state would they find her in? Sheriff Morrison's hand actually shook as he worked the lock, and when the door finally swung open, what they saw was somehow both better and worse than what they'd been expecting. The room was smaller than the others, barely more than a closet, with no furniture at all, but it had been transformed. Every inch of the walls, the ceiling, even parts of the floor had been covered with drawings. Beautiful, intricate, fantastical drawings done in what looked like charcoal and chalk and pieces of colored stone. There were flowers and birds and magical creatures, all the things little Margaret had loved to draw in school, but elaborated and expanded until they filled the entire space with color and life and desperate beauty. And in the center of this artistic sanctuary, curled up on a pile of rags that served as her bed, was Margaret herself. She was tiny, even for 12, her growth clearly stunted by malnutrition. Her hair had been roughly chopped short, and she was dressed in rags that might have once been a nightgown but were now barely recognizable as clothing. When the men entered, she didn't react at all. She simply continued staring at one of her drawings on the wall, a massive phoenix rising from flames that covered most of one side of her prison. Dr. Cross knelt down beside her, speaking gently, but Margaret gave no sign that she heard him. Her eyes didn't move. She didn't blink. She might have been a statue for all the life she showed. It was only when they tried to lift her, to carry her out of that place, that she finally responded. She began to scream. Not words, just sound, a high-pitched wail of pure terror that didn't seem like it could come from such a small body. She fought them with surprising strength, scratching and biting and kicking, and when they finally managed to wrap her in a blanket and carry her out, she continued to scream, the sound echoing through the house and out into the night, a sound that would wake everyone in Ashford Hollow and draw them from their homes to see what horror was unfolding on Sorrow Hill. They brought all 3 children out of the house and down into the town, where Dr. Cross and his wife set up an emergency infirmary in the church hall. Margaret screamed for hours before finally exhausting herself and falling into a fitful sleep. Wilhelm remained catatonic, unresponsive to any attempt to communicate with him. Only Anna seemed relatively functional, though her cheerful demeanor and disconnected chatter made it clear that her mind had been irreparably damaged by her years of imprisonment. But there was still one member of the Matthias family unaccounted for, Gustav himself. The men returned to the house on Sorrow Hill as dawn was breaking, this time searching more thoroughly, looking for the man who had created this nightmare. They searched every room, every closet, every possible hiding place. They found more horrors as they went, detailed journals in Gustav's handwriting describing his experiments in behavioral modification, his theories about breaking the human will, his belief that absolute control over his family was not just his right but his duty. They found instruments of punishment, whips, chains, devices designed to cause pain without leaving permanent marks. They found a locked cabinet, full of medical texts on psychology and neurology, all annotated in Gustav's meticulous handwriting, with notes on how these theories could be applied to his own children. And finally, in the tower room that had been built specially, the room the workers had whispered about, they found Gustav. He was sitting in a chair that he'd apparently brought up himself, positioned in front of the single high window so he could watch the sunrise. In his lap was a pistol. On the floor beside him was a letter addressed to no one, explaining nothing. The letter contained only a single sentence written over and over in increasingly shaky handwriting. They were mine to do with as I pleased. Gustav Matthias had shot himself through the head sometime during the night, probably around the same time the men were breaking down his front door. He had chosen escape over accountability, had denied everyone, especially his children, the opportunity for justice and answers. The discovery of Gustav's body should have brought some sense of closure to the nightmare, but instead it only deepened the horror. Because in death, Gustav Matthias had achieved what he'd sought in life: total control. He would never have to answer for what he'd done. He would never have to face his children and acknowledge their suffering. He would never have to sit in a courtroom and hear the details of his cruelty read back to him. He had simply left. The investigation into the Matthias case became the most extensive criminal inquiry in Pennsylvania's history up to that point. Sheriff Morrison brought in help from larger cities, and together they pieced together a timeline of abuse that stretched back not just the 6 years the family had been in Ashford Hollow, but further to their time in Philadelphia before they'd moved. They discovered that Gustav had been investigated there for cruelty to his children, but had managed to escape prosecution by moving before charges could be filed. They discovered that his fortune hadn't come from shipping at all, but from an inheritance he'd received after the mysterious death of his own parents, deaths that were ruled accidental at the time, but now seemed far more suspicious. They discovered that this pattern of abuse and control had been Gustav's entire life, that he had built his whole existence around the domination and destruction of his own family. The trial that everyone expected never happened. With Gustav dead, there was no one to prosecute. The children were deemed unreliable witnesses due to their psychological state. Helena, when she finally recovered enough to speak coherently, could testify to what had been done but not provide legal proof that would stand up in court of the 1840s. The case became a matter of public record, of testimony heard and recorded but never adjudicated. 3 separate juries were assembled to review the evidence, and 3 separate times they refused to deliberate, the jurors stating that they couldn't bear to hear any more, that the details were too disturbing, that they feared it would break something in them to sit in judgment of such horror, even though the perpetrator was already dead. The public reaction was swift and visceral. The house on Sorrow Hill was stripped of everything valuable, then burned to the ground by a mob of townspeople who couldn't bear the thought of it standing there as a monument to what had happened within its walls. The fire burned for 3 days, and when it was done, nothing remained but the foundation and the stone walls of the cellar, which the town eventually buried under tons of earth, literally trying to bury the memory of what had been done there. Gustav's body was denied burial in consecrated ground. It was eventually interred in an unmarked grave far from town, the location kept secret to prevent vandalism. Helena Matthias survived physically but never truly recovered. She lived another 8 years, most of them spent in a kind of waking catatonia, cared for by Sarah Brennan, who had tried to help her years earlier. Helena died in 1855, and her last words whispered to Sarah, "Where I should have saved them." The children's fates were equally tragic, though in different ways. Wilhelm never recovered his ability to speak coherently. He spent the rest of his life in the care of a religious community that specialized in caring for the mentally ill, living until 1872, and dying at the age of 44, still suffering from the trauma of his imprisonment. His episodes continued throughout his life, moments where he would return mentally to that cellar, to those years of abuse, unable to escape even in freedom. Anna's brilliant mind, which had once held so much promise, never fully returned from the break it had suffered. She cycled between periods of cheerful disconnect from reality and periods of catatonic depression. She was cared for by the same religious community that housed Wilhelm, and the 2 siblings at least had each other in their broken state. Anna died in 1869 at the age of 44, having never truly left the prison her mind had built to protect itself from the prison her father had built for her body. Of the 3 children, only Margaret showed any real signs of recovery, though even her healing was incomplete. The girl who had stopped speaking eventually found her voice again, though it took 3 years of patient, gentle care by a foster family who took her in. She never spoke about what had been done to her, never confirmed or denied the details that had been discovered. She simply moved forward, one day at a time, rebuilding a life from the ashes of her childhood. Margaret learned a trade, became a seamstress like Sarah Brennan, who had tried to help her mother, and eventually married a kind man who knew her story and loved her anyway. She had children of her own, raised them with gentleness and care, and by all accounts broke the cycle of abuse that had defined her family. She lived until 1901, dying at the age of 66, surrounded by the family she had built, a family defined by love rather than terror. But she never drew again. Picked up charcoal or chalk or pencil. The art that had been her sanctuary in that small prison had become too associated with that trauma, and she couldn't separate the beauty from the horror. That part of her died in that cellar and never came back. The case of the Matthias family sent shockwaves through not just Ashford Hollow but through all of Pennsylvania, and eventually throughout much of America as the details became public. It sparked intense debate about parental rights versus children's welfare, about the limits of privacy when abuse is suspected, about the responsibility of communities to intervene even when it means violating social norms about family autonomy. Several states, influenced by the Matthias case, began to pass early versions of what would eventually become child protection laws, though real systemic change would take decades more and countless other tragedies. The case also profoundly impacted everyone who had been part of that community, everyone who had seen the warning signs and chosen to look away. Pastor Schneider never forgave himself for not doing more after he heard that scream during his visit to the house. He left Ashford Hollow in 1849 and spent the rest of his ministry working with abused children, trying in some way to make amends for his failure to save the Matthias children when he had the chance. Sarah Brennan, who had tried to help Helena, became a fierce advocate for women's rights and protections, arguing that until women had legal recourse and independence, cases like the Matthias family would continue to happen. She gave speeches and wrote pamphlets, and worked until her death in 1878 to create systems that would protect vulnerable women and children from domestic abuse. Mr. Cornelius Webb, the schoolmaster who had noticed Anna and Wilhelm's distress but hadn't pushed hard enough to investigate, left teaching entirely. He became a doctor, specializing in the treatment of childhood trauma, and dedicated his life to understanding how to heal minds broken by abuse. His work, primitive by modern standards but revolutionary for his time, laid early groundwork for what would eventually become child psychology. Dr. Cross, who had examined the children and documented their physical and psychological state, published a detailed medical paper about the case that became one of the first comprehensive studies of long-term abuse and its effects on child development. The paper was controversial, considered too disturbing for polite society, but it influenced a generation of doctors and reformers who understood that child abuse was a medical issue as much as a moral one. As for Ashford Hollow itself, the town never recovered from the scandal. The population began to decline almost immediately as families chose to leave, unable to live with the constant reminder of what had happened on Sorrow Hill. By 1860, the town had shrunk to less than half its former size. By 1880, it was effectively abandoned, and by 1900, it had been completely absorbed into the surrounding townships, its name disappearing from maps as if it had never existed. The land where the house had stood, where the cellar had been buried, was eventually sold and resold, though it remained undeveloped. Locals whispered that the land was cursed, that nothing good could grow there, that the earth itself remembered what had been done and rejected any attempt to build something new on that foundation of suffering. Modern researchers who've studied the case believe this is likely psychological projection rather than any supernatural influence, but the fact remains that land still sits empty today, nearly 200 years later, a vacant lot on a hill that still, in some local circles, is called Sorrow Hill. The sealed documents I mentioned at the beginning, the ones that were locked away for over a century and 20 years, were finally opened in 1971 as part of a historical research project into early child welfare cases. The researchers who read them, hardened academics who had studied human cruelty in all its forms, reported being physically ill after reading Gustav's journals and Helena's diaries. The psychological detail, the methodical nature of the abuse, the sheer calculation behind every act of cruelty was overwhelming even to people trained to remain objective. Some of those documents were resealed, deemed too disturbing for public consumption even in the more open social climate of the 1970s. Others were kept for research purposes, but with strict limitations on access. The full truth of what happened in that house, day by day, year by year, may never be fully known. Perhaps that's for the best. Perhaps some darkness is too profound to fully examine without being changed by it. But the broad strokes, the undeniable facts of the case, remain as a stark reminder of what can happen when we choose comfort over courage, when we prioritize privacy over protection, when we see warning signs and convince ourselves that it's not our place to intervene. So what's the message here? What are we supposed to take from this nightmare that unfolded nearly 200 years ago? First, understand that abuse thrives in silence and isolation. Every person who saw something wrong with the Matthias family, every worker who noticed the strange layout of the house, every neighbor who heard odd sounds, every teacher who saw the children's distress, every shopkeeper who noticed Helena's bruises, all of them saw pieces of the truth. But they saw those pieces in isolation, didn't share their concerns, didn't push for answers. They assumed someone else would do something, or that it wasn't their business, or that they might be wrong and didn't want to cause trouble. That collective silence allowed the abuse to continue for years. Second, understand that monsters don't always look like monsters. Gustav Matthias was by all accounts a respectable member of the community, well-dressed, well-spoken, financially successful. He wasn't some obvious villain. He was someone's neighbor, someone's business partner, someone who functioned perfectly well in public society while committing atrocities in private. We want to believe that evil is easy to spot, that abusers have some visible mark that identifies them, but the truth is that they often blend in perfectly, which is how they get away with it for so long. Third, understand the importance of giving voice to the voiceless. The Matthias children tried to communicate their suffering in the ways available to them. Anna's academic brilliance and protective nature, Wilhelm's episodes and anxiety, Margaret's changing artwork, all of these were cries for help in the only language they had. But the adults around them either didn't recognize these signs or chose not to act on them. Children, especially children being abused, often can't directly ask for help. They communicate through behavior, through art, through symptoms that we have to be willing to see and interpret correctly. Fourth, understand that legal and social systems can either protect the vulnerable or enable their abuse. In 1847, a father's authority over his children was nearly absolute. The systems in place protected Gustav's rights as a parent far more than they protected his children's right to safety. We've made progress since then, but these systems are still imperfect. There are still gaps where abuse can flourish, still situations where the rights of abusers are given more weight than the welfare of victims. Constant vigilance and reform are necessary to close these gaps. And finally, understand that recovery from trauma is possible but never complete. Margaret Matthias, the only one of the children who achieved anything like a normal life, did so through years of patient care, supportive relationships, and her own incredible resilience. But even she carried the scars of what was done to her for her entire life. Some wounds heal, but they leave marks. Some losses can't be fully recovered, and that's okay. Survival is enough. Building a new life is enough. You don't have to completely overcome trauma to have a life worth living. The Matthias case is disturbing not because it's unique, though thankfully cases this extreme are rare, but because it represents in stark terms dynamics that exist in less extreme forms in countless families. Control masked as concern, abuse justified as discipline, suffering hidden behind closed doors, communities choosing not to see what makes them uncomfortable. These patterns continue today, in different forms perhaps, but with the same fundamental dynamics. So if you're watching this and you see something in your own life, in someone you know, in a family in your community, that echoes any part of this story, please don't look away. Don't convince yourself it's not your business. Don't assume someone else will handle it. Because the lesson of the Matthias family, the lesson written in the suffering of those 3 children and the desperate, too late actions of their mother, is that silence enables abuse. Privacy can become a prison, and sometimes being uncomfortable, risking being wrong, violating social norms about minding your own business, is exactly what's needed to save a life. The house on Sorrow Hill is gone, burned to the ground and buried under earth. The family that suffered within it is long dead, their pain finally ended by time if not by justice. But their story remains as a warning and a call to action. Watch for the signs, listen to the whispers, believe what you see even when it seems impossible. And when you have the chance to help, when you see something wrong and have the power to act, remember the 3 children in that cellar. And choose courage over comfort. Choose action over silence. Because every time we look away, every time we choose not to see, we become complicit in the suffering we could have prevented. That's the real horror of the Matthias case. Not just what Gustav did to his family, but what everyone else didn't do to stop him. Don't let that be your story. Don't let that be your legacy. See something, say something, do something. Before it's too late. Before another family disappears behind closed doors. Before another child's scream goes unanswered. The dead can't speak for themselves anymore, but we can speak for them. We can learn from their suffering and do better. We have to do better. Because if we don't, if we continue to choose silence and comfort over courage and action, then every tragedy like this that happens in the future is not just on the abuser. It's on all of us. That's the message. That's what we take from this horror story that actually happened. That's why this case, as disturbing as it is, needs to be remembered rather than forgotten. Not to satisfy morbid curiosity, but to motivate moral action. Not to dwell in darkness, but to commit to bringing light. The Matthias family's suffering can't be undone. But it can mean something. It can be the story that makes one person speak up, that saves one child, that breaks one cycle of abuse. And if it does that, if remembering this horror prevents future horror, then maybe, finally, those 3 children who suffered so much can rest in peace, knowing their story mattered, that their pain wasn't meaningless, that they helped save others from experiencing what they experienced. That's the only justice left to give them now. That's the only way to honor their memory. Remember them, learn from them, and do better. That's all we can do. But it's everything. Thank you for watching. And please, don't keep this story to yourself. Share it, discuss it. Let it change how you see the world and how you act in it. Because stories like this, as disturbing as they are, have the power to change society, to shift how we think about responsibility and community and protecting the vulnerable. That power only works if we're willing to engage with the discomfort, to sit with the horror, and to emerge from it committed to doing better. The children of Ashford Hollow are counting on us. All the children, Eve, Ryware, who are suffering in silence, are counting on us. Don't let them down. This story, while fictionalized in its specific details and created for this narrative, represents the very real dynamics of family abuse, community complicity, and the failures of social systems that have occurred throughout history and continue today. If you or someone you know is experiencing abuse, please reach out to local authorities or organizations dedicated to helping victims of domestic violence and child abuse. Your voice matters, your action matters, and it's never too late to help.